Welcome everybody to our haunted event here at the USA Marx Library. I'm excited to see everybody out here tonight. A lot of people have dressed the part for sure, and even those of you who didn't dress the part, I think y'all dressed the part too. So thank y'all for coming out. My name's Chris Andrews, and I'm going to be the host for tonight. And I'm excited. We've got just kind of set the expectations for this evening. We've got an illustrious panel that's going to be speaking to you tonight about some haunted history throughout the Mobile. So we've got 300 years plus of history here in the city of Mobile. So we are no shortage of dark and ghostly stories that we've had throughout our history. So I'm excited for them to be able to share that with you. And after they share, they're going to share for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then we'll open it up to y'all and have a question and answer session. And so, you know, y'all fire away at the questions and anything that maybe you've encountered or hope to encounter at some point maybe. Let us know about that. Following our event, we will have refreshments upstairs, and we've got some haunted themed refreshments for you. So y'all stick around for that. It's all free. And again, thanks for coming out. My name is Chris Andrews. I'm with the Emil Bites Food Tour, and we do walking food tours through downtown Mobile. And about 5 years ago, we started doing haunted food tours, and so it's haunted themed. So we go to different restaurants and we have food. Some of the restaurants they get into it a little bit as well with some haunted themed cocktails. One of the popular ones are the Blood Bag. That is served on the tour, and it's a hospital bag with bourbon and juice, and it's you know, straight out of a hospital bag. So it's always a favorite, but we've enjoyed doing that, and I think, you know, we've really found out that, you know, these are some of those popular tours that we do all year, and I think people in Mobile we like haunted stories here in Mobile, so it's something about it, and I think tonight we'll kind of uncover some of those as well, but. I've got a question that I wanted to ask everyone, maybe with a raise of hands. Who knows the person who lived in the house before them? Your house that you live in. Does anybody know the person who lived in the house before you? All right. What about 25 years before you? Just a few. So you can imagine the French arrived here on the shores of Mobile Bay, 1699. And like many of us, had no idea who was here before us. The French arrived here, and staring back at them when they arrived were mountains of bones and skeletons, human remains stared back at them. And they probably asked themselves the same question that a lot of us ask ourselves on a daily basis here in Mobile: what kind of crazy people live in this part of the world? And so that's kind of the story. That's how we got started. The French would go on to found Mobile, 1702. Just 27 miles north of here, and in present-day Mobile, 1711. But you know, so you can imagine that was the French's first impression of this place when they arrived here. Was what we refer to as Dolphin Island. They refer to as Massacre Island for that very reason. And you know, there's a lot of different theories about why those bones and skeletons were there. The most likely is that a hurricane had washed ashore an old Indian burial ground. And so that's the most likely theory. But it kind of, you know, I think about there's a lot of places like Dolphin Island and other places that around Mobile that are haunted and we don't think about. Another one would be Cathedral Square. If you've been downtown to the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception and walked along Cathedral Square there, maybe been to Art Walk downtown on Friday nights. Cathedral Square is the site of the first of some of Mobile's oldest residents, the first graveyard. The Campo Santo is what the Spanish called it there. So they would have had graves there would have been marked with old wooden crosses, and so some of Mobile's oldest residents were buried there. Church Street Graveyard opened in 1820, and a lot of people were disinterred and moved to the Church Street Graveyard from the Campo Santo. But a lot of people did not get moved. So Spanish soldiers and slaves, Native Americans, anyone with poor means, are still 6 feet under there at the Campo Santo at Cathedral Square. And so if you're out on Art Walk some Friday nights and you see some flickering lights and you might see some strange occurrences, that you might want to keep in mind the fact that, like I said, there's still some of Mobile's oldest residents are still below you right there at Cathedral Square. Well, I'm excited about, I'm going to turn it over to our panel of guests, and I want to introduce them to you. Our first panelist, we've got Mr. Tom McGee. And Tom McGee is the museum director out at Bellingraph Gardens and Bellingraph Gardens and Home. And of course, he is also an expert when it comes to Mobile cemeteries, and specifically Magnolia Cemetery, which is home to some of Mobile's oldest residents as well. Many notable residents are buried there. And next we got Miss Mary Palmer. She is the author of a book called Boyington Oak, A Grave Injustice, which she has for sale outside at a booth. I hope you'll maybe pick up a copy on your way out. But she's uncovered and researched one of the most fascinating stories in Mobile's history, and that's the murder of Nathaniel Frost and the trial of Charles Boyington. So I'm excited for you to hear her and her expertise in that. And then Ms. Taylor Volz is the director out of the Historic Mobile Preservation Society and the Oakleigh Home and Museum. And so I'm going to turn it over to them, and Mr. Tom will go ahead and start, and we'll go ahead and get started. So y'all welcome our panel.
Thank you, Chris. You were encroaching on my subject here. Because my topic is Mobile's 19th century cemeteries, mourning customers, and exploding corpses. Actually, Campo Santo was not the first cemetery. The first cemetery is found on a 1711 map and was located northwest of today's Christchurch Cathedral downtown and had no name attached to it. After that, Campo Santo, or it translates as Holy Field, was established. And the burying ground stretched roughly from Jackson Street to Franklin Street, so almost from the Sanger Theater all the way beyond the current cathedral. And then it spread west, from north to south, from Conti to Dauphin. The Conti Street had not been cut in yet. But it was just a very rough kind of a cemetery. There were no plots, there was no layout to it. People just buried them, and that was considered well outside the city limits at that point. And then as Mobile became a city and part of the United States, a city cemetery was needed. So they established Church Street Cemetery, and the first burial took place in 1819, even though the actual deed was not signed until 1820. That's how necessary they needed a cemetery. And the reason for its creation was yellow fever epidemics. In 1819, half of our population died from the yellow fever epidemic. So they were rapidly trying to find a place to put all these bodies, and it filled up Campo Santo pretty quickly. And Church Street Cemetery at that time was more than a half-mile southwest of the inhabited portions of the city. So it was way out and removed. They would not have put a cemetery at that point right in the middle of town. That idea kind of goes away in America really in the late 18th century. People started getting at it as probably not a good idea to have these rotting corpses in the neighborhood. You wanted to put them out for various reasons. Now, when they established Church Street Cemetery, they had it in 3 sections. One, which I can't quite understand what these meant, were for strangers. So I don't know if that meant people that were visiting Mobile and died and they didn't know what to do with them. And then that section was for Masons and Oddfellows, Masonic orders. And while the 3rd section was reserved for veterans, mainly at that point were veterans from War of 1812. Then another section, the 2nd section, was for Catholic burials, and the 3rd for Protestant burials. So it's very much designated for the different areas. And the entrance to Church Street Cemetery has kind of moved around over the years until now you would enter past on the main library. And in 1820, a city sexton was hired, and he received a sum of $7 for digging the grave to a depth of 5 feet and supplying a hearse for the coffin. And in 1827, the local Catholic Church, which had been standing on the northwest corner of Royal and Conti Street since 1792, went up in flames, and the Catholics decided they were going to build a cathedral. So they looked west, and they owned most of the property of Campo Santo Cemetery. So they built a temporary church on Conti Street facing what today would be the south side of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, and then decided to build the cathedral where it is today. So that's why Campo Santo was closed, and they contacted as many families as they could to remove the bodies and put them in the new cemetery, Church Street Cemetery. And as you said, there were a lot of people buried there, and we're talking about wooden crosses. There were no big granite markers, so these names have been forgotten over the 100 years. So they're no telling how many people are buried all under the sidewalks and streets there. In fact, the last time I heard, I think it was the 1930s, they were doing sewer repair behind the cathedral back on Franklin Street and unearthed a lot of bones back there. So they were just left there. Now, yellow fever epidemics, as I mentioned, they came frequently during our long, hot summers here. And in some cases, entire families would fall victim to the disease. And as an Episcopal minister later recalled, who witnessed all this, the panic of a yellow fever epidemic would strike in social standing, education, and even professed Christianity did nothing to overcome the craven selfishness of citizens as they fled the city or tried to. When the victims were buried, ministers were required to stand at least 10 feet away from the casket and the gravesite and to try and stand, quote, on the windward side. Well, the city grew rapidly, of course, by the 1830s, and it was evident that Church Street Cemetery was getting kind of full and would not adequate in a few years. And it was also now surrounded by houses and businesses that had moved out in that direction. So, and remember, the idea of germs as causing disease was decades away, and it wasn't until the 1880s that we knew about germs. And it was thought that mysterious ground vapors were causing things like yellow fever epidemics. And obviously, ground surrounding rotting wooden coffins with corpses inside had to be suspect. So in 1835, the first land acquisitions took place to create what is now known as Magnolia Cemetery, but at the time it was called the New City Cemetery. Today it has over 100 acres and roughly 100,000 residents. The cemetery was laid out on a standardized grid plan with lots of specific size. This is a 19th century phenomenon. The other cemeteries like Campbell Cemetery, there were no specified lots. It was just kind of haphazard the way people were buried. Well, the city, and remember that the families, when you bought a lot, it was your lot, it was like your piece of real estate. You were required to go in there and mow it and keep it clean. There was nobody from the cemetery association going there and mowing it for you. So the city ceased burials in Church Street Cemetery in 1898, and that rendered Magnolia Cemetery as Mobile's only active city-owned cemetery, and it is still an active cemetery. But it wasn't until 1987 that a perpetual care trust fund was established by the Friends of Magnolia Cemetery, which hired our own crew and today maintains the entire cemetery. Now, the Catholic section of Church Street Cemetery was almost full, and the diocese bought land north of 3 Mile Creek, where Catholic Cemetery was opened in 1848. And like Magnolia, it has been enlarged several times between 1866 and 1948. Now, I want to look a little bit, that's a little brief history of cemeteries up to the 19th century. Looking at death in the 19th century. There was no such thing as a funeral industry early in the 19th century. Undertakers doubled as furniture craftsmen. Like Thomas Chippendale was making caskets on the side, as well as dining room tables and furniture. It was considered a craft that they would do it. Then a lot of the times they would kind of merge or be located next to a livery stable, because you needed a wagon and horses to take the casket to the graveyard. So it ends up late in the 19th century that you have this funeral business getting started. So undertaking parlors didn't even exist in Mobile until very late in the 19th century. And even then, most people still had their funerals at home. And the families themselves prepared the bodies for burial, but not at the mortuary. Now, embalming of the bodies came slowly. The early embalming of bodies was a very inexact science. And if it went wrong, the buildup of gases inside a closed casket could be spectacular. In fact, Henry VIII's body exploded as it lay overnight in his coffin in Syon Abbey in England. I'm glad I didn't have to do that for that. Well, the Civil War, we can thank the Civil War for the improvements to embalming because of all the carnage. All those bodies had to be transported back, and they found ways to embalm them. And by the Victorian era in England, the embalming methods had gotten so good that one Dr. Martin van Buchel had his dead wife's body had her blood vessels injected with carmine and had glass eyes inserted in her and had her propped up in the parlor for people to come see. And that lasted until he remarried and the second wife decided her predecessor had to. Now, display of the deceased not in that way is as part of the funeral ceremony goes back centuries. In England, as we just witnessed, when an important noble died, it could take weeks to arrange a funeral, and since the actual corpse was decomposing rapidly, a wax or wooden image would also stand in for the deceased. That is the origin of Madame Tussaud's business. If you ever see Madame Tussaud's waxworks, that's how she got started, putting fake bodies there for the public to come view when the original couldn't be seen. Now, the only odd case I could really find in Mobile was a story of a house over on St. Louis Street. The author did not tell us the family name, but they did tell us the daughter's name. Her name was Pauline. She was the youngest, and she died, whether it was from typhoid or yellow fever, I don't know. But the funeral ended in the parlor. The mortuary man came with a wagon to get the casket taken to the cemetery. The mother went crazy and threw herself across the casket and sobbed. So they left the casket there overnight. They came back the next day. She was even more hysterical. And after about the third or fourth try, they just gave up. Well, the neighbors did complain a good bit about this casket being in the neighbor's parlor day and night. And then they would have a country place up in Citronelle, and they would put Pauline in the casket up and take it up the country for the summertime. And this went on for several years until authorities finally, the story goes, made them bury Pauline in the proper grave, not haul her back and forth to Citronelle. Now, something to think about. I've used the word casket and coffin. These terms, originally we called them coffins. They were wedge-shaped, they were wooden, they were simple. By the middle of the night, and the word casket for a lady meant a beautiful jewel box that she kept her jewelry or love letters in, or something precious. In the 19th century, as we start romanticizing death and dying, they start calling a coffin a casket, and it becomes rectangular, as we're familiar with it now. In fact, by 1876, one of the exhibitors in the great centennial that we had that year, the Philadelphia Centennial, was the Stein Patent Burial Casket Works. If you can imagine going to a World Fair and walking in and seeing caskets lined up, that's how the business was really taking off. And another change that took place at this point was using artificial turf around the gravesite, and the idea that the casket would not be lowered into the grave until after the mourners had left. Now, the ritual of mourning meant that a widow wore, quote-unquote, deep mourning for over a year, including a heavy black crepe veil. Only simple black jewelry could be worn, and a widow's calling cards and writing paper was always banded with a black band. And after years, she could lighten up and go to black silk. Now, this is my favorite. This is what I call I'm Not Dead Yet. The 19th century obsession with premature burials. It's called taphophobia. That is the fear of being buried alive. George Washington apparently suffered from this because he specifically said his body had to lie on his deathbed for 3 days before he was going to be buried. So you want to make sure he was good and dead before he was taken out. And by 1844, we've got Edgar Allan Poe writing a story called The Premature Burial, which really gets readers thinking about this horrible thing that this is really taking place. And he was quoted saying, "It's to be buried alive is beyond question the most terrifying of extremes." Well, by 1882, an inventor patented a, quote, device indicating life in buried persons. And his device had a rope to be tied around the dead person's wrist, or the person that appeared to be dead, and if it was tugged on, it would release a flag up above the grave. Hopefully this would be in the daytime when people would be around to see this flag flying over this grave, meaning somebody's down there. There was even in 1896 the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burials. I mean, they even had an organization to keep this from happening. And one of the members and founders published a book entitled Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented. William Tebb swore that suffocation in a closed coffin was surely worse than being tortured on the rack or being burned at the stake. He further made the claim that as many as 2,700 people a year were being buried alive due to being in a trance or a dead faint. And stories started abounding. Two of them, my favorite was that a crypt was reopened 2 months after a corpse had been put in, and they discovered that the casket glass had been cracked the man's fists were being clenched, and they were full of his hair, where he pulled his hair out in desperation. And then another was a child who was had sickened and supposedly died, was placed in the family tomb. And when the next family member was to be brought into the tomb, they discovered her skeleton inside the doorway of the tomb, where she'd gotten out of her casket and collapsed, scratching the door trying to get out. Now, I don't know if any of these are true, but these are the kind of tales they would tell about why we needed these things. Now, Mr. Tebbs recommended that your coffin should be fitted with an iron tube leading up to the surface. At the first sign of movement, in the casket, a box opens above, allowing light and air down to the person in the casket. Then another flag raises 4 feet above the surface, and a bell rings for 30 minutes. And this is after electricity, so he recommended an electric light be attached to that box at the surface, allowing light down to your coffin. The iron tube to the surface, he said, also allows for the inmate of the coffin to speak and his feeble voice to be heard above. Now, much of these worries were put to rest with the advent of the death certificate signed by a qualified physician certifying the person was really dead. And Tebb, who died in 1917, insisted that his body was not to be disposed of until, quote, unmistakable evidence of decomposition was visible. He was cremated a week after his death. Well, that's just to look at some of Mobile's death in that Victorian era, when death was certainly more a part than what it is today for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tom. And at this time, we'll welcome Miss Mary Palmer. She's, again, author of the Boyington Oak. And I'm excited for you to hear the story.
Okay. Boo! I would like to touch on one thing that Tom said about the coffin. I found out in my research that they built coffins the way they did, narrow at the bottom and wider at the top, because they could save money that way. They used less wood. I thought that was very interesting. Who knows the Boyington Oak story? How many of you know something about it? Okay. How many of you have visited the site? Anyone? Yeah, it's kind of spooky, isn't it? And it's well known. It's Mobile's most famous legend. And Mobile certainly has its share of ghost stories, but one is most famous, the one about Boyington Oak. It's the oldest and the most famous legend. And this legend, connected with Southern history, dates back to 1833. There's quite a story about it. Charles Boyington was 19 years old when he came to Mobile as a printer in 1833. That's quite an accomplishment for a man that young to become a printer, because it's about the equivalent of getting a college education and degree. And then when he got here, he was quickly accused and convicted of killing his best friend, Nathaniel Frost. Nathaniel Frost boarded with him in William George's boarding house. I don't know exactly where, somewhere around the Royal Street area downtown. So when he was convicted, he said that this tree would grow to prove his innocence. Well, it did grow, and this is the same tree, which is 188 years old now. And after Sally, I ran down there to see if it was still there. I thought, whoops, what happens? Nothing happened. It is still there. Peter Toller said that the roots of this, he's an arborist, he said the roots of this tree go 100 feet in either direction, and he said that it's eerie because Boyington's remains no doubt grew up in the roots, so he gained some form of immortality by having that happen. And then after I got into the story, I found out that everything was based on circumstantial evidence at the trial. There was one slave girl that said that she heard something going on in the Church Street Cemetery, but they would never have listened to a slave girl in court at that time. So when he was convicted, it was all circumstantial evidence. Furthermore, there were 2 jurors who were unqualified. One was a British citizen, and if you ever look up what qualifies you for being a juror, it's that you have to be a citizen of the United States. The other believed he was guilty from the beginning and said so openly. Then later, I found out there were 2 deathbed confessions, one by William George, his landlord, and the other by a woman who was probably a prostitute and a girlfriend of Nathaniel Frost, and that was a deathbed confession where she brought chief of police Felder to her bedside to confess. We do illustrate this in a play that I'll tell you about later in my speech. So he just got sort of railroaded. Mobile then and even now is probably a little bit cliquish, so he ingratiated himself and got to be a guest at a Mardi Gras type ball, which is at the Alabama Hotel, and now that would be the site of the Battle House, I understand. But anyway, he went to that and met Rose DeFleur, and she stuck with him till the end. And there's a whole lot more to that part. But after I found out about those deathbed confessions, I started forming a Boyington Oak Society, and we have some prominent Mobilians involved. And I found out from Palmer Hamilton, who is now deceased, but he was an attorney in Mobile at the launch party for my book. He invited me to his house, and he had a picture, a painting. There was no photography then. He had a painting of his great-grandfather, and it was the man who was Reverend William Hamilton, who counseled Boyington in jail. Boyington claimed to be an atheist, so he never did convince Boyington to confess, even though he kept telling him, confess and save your soul. But he never did. But Boyington did invite him to walk to the gallows with him. And they walked from the Conde Charlotte house, which was Mobile's first jail, to Buzzard's Roost. I understand that was identified later as Washington Square. So anyway, all of that went on, and we got an attorney involved. The law, the way it was written, it was restricted, and Boyington was not eligible, but now he got the law changed just a little bit to make it so that Boyington will be eligible for a posthumous pardon, and all the paperwork is in. We're waiting for one more thing, a petition, and then hopefully he can get a posthumous pardon. So that's the basic story of it. But when you go to the tree, then Charles said, we grow to prove his innocence. You kind of get a feeling in the air that's spooky. And so if you've seen it, you might have felt, anybody try to listen to the voices they say when, those of you who went to the tree, anybody try to lean their ear against the tree and listen to the voices? No? Okay. Well, they say, I didn't hear any, but they say that some people do hear the voices. And it's kind of as if Charles being very close to where the murder took place made it spookier. It reaches into your senses. But anyway, you're reminded that this oak tree with all these roots did grow, and that the legend of the tree is the lore of Mobile. The graveyard wall fell, and it was in Potter's Field. So when the wall fell, I don't know when, they never did put it back up, because it was around the part that's Potter's Field. And though many acorns fall there, and you can go down there any time and find them, and other oak trees have grown, the Boyington Oak was not felled during any of these storms, and we've had many, many storms during this long period of time. I was really relieved, I should say, when I found out it survived south. Interesting things happened, odd things happened when I was writing this book. And one was as if fate had a hand in helping, and I'll get to it in a minute. But the first thing that struck me just the other day, when I was kind of glancing back at some of the things in the book, was that when Charles arrived in Mobile, it was the same point in time when stars fell on Alabama. How many of you have heard that song, Stars Fell on Alabama? Okay. It was meteors, wasn't meteors. But I mean, that was eerie that he got his start in Mobile at such an unusual event. And then there's a story that was quite interesting because it led us to find a descendant of Boyington. My editor, Shannon Brown, and I went to the first jail to talk to someone that she knew there. Her name was Marie Solomon. Any of you know Marie Solomon? No? Okay, anyway, she's a docent there. And when we got there, she showed us around a little bit. We told her, you know, what the progress was on the book. And then about a week later, we called her back to talk to her about some of the details. And she said, didn't you say that person you're writing about was named Boyington? And I said, yes. And she said, well, there was a Boyington that came in here just last week, but she couldn't remember where he came from. So I had to go downtown to find out where he came from, and he came from Dothan. And he actually is a descendant, and he's the vice president now of the Boyington Oak Society. He comes to almost everything we have, meetings and events, and he's really taken a big part in it. I talked to him the other day, and he's coming back for the event that we're going to have next weekend, the 5th and 6th of November. It'll be the mock trial, and it'll be at the first jail. Boyington was in that jail from the time of the murder was in May, and then he was in there waiting for the judge until November, and the trial was in November. And then after that, he was there until February, when he was hanged February 20th at age 19. It wasn't easy to check on these things because there was no record of the trial, but there was one book by Francois Diard that he wrote and published in 1949, and it's more didactic, more like these are the facts, you know, not like a novel. My book is more like a novel, and it is creative nonfiction, which means that you have to embellish some things. You don't know what somebody said exactly 188 years ago, but you try to read about what they could have said and use the vernacular, and that's what I tried to do. But when I was looking for Preston Boyington's his name in Dothan, I couldn't get anywhere. I tried to, okay, competition. I tried to find him and I couldn't, and so finally I thought, well, I'm just going to call the Chamber of Commerce. Well, I can talk to people quite a while on the phone, so I talked to a wrong number 20 minutes one time. But anyway, other than that, I got this girl in Dothan at the Chamber. She did not know him, but she got very interested in the project, so she helped me find his mother. Then when I found his mother, she told me he was out of town, so it was another week or so, but eventually we got together, and it's developed in quite an interesting thing to know him and to know a lawyer whose grandfather, great-grandfather, was actually a part of the trial. And then while writing this book, it was odd. I have a ghost called Ezekiel that I don't even believe in, but he shows up every now and then and makes noise. But so I'm kind of skeptical about those things. But computer files would just disappear with my editor. I would send her something, and then they'd be gone. And then finally they'd come back. And then there didn't seem to be a reason. Papers, I put a paper on my bar one day, and I was writing on it, and I went out for a few minutes. I went back, that paper was gone. I have never found it. It sounded like he said, quit messing with me. But I missed important messages that I would get on email, and it just seems like Charles was testing to see if I persevered. Am I covering something else? Oh, I keep turning it on. See? Spooky. Well, first was difficult, then things kind of fall into place. When I get on to something, I'm like a dog with a bone. I'm not going to let go of it no matter what happens. And then people came along who needed. And then I went to the launch party at Fairhope, and a man came up to me and he said, I've been trying to write a song about Boyington's Oak, and I can't get it in my head. He bought the book, and about 3 or 4 weeks later, he wrote me an email and said he'd written this song. So he comes to things and sings it. Right now, he's a little incapacitated, but he's going to, he doesn't care if I get somebody else to sing it, and I'll tell you about that later with the event coming up. Then, also, one day, the person who wrote the foreword, Maureen McClay, and this was even interesting because she actually helped with the first book I wrote, Memorabilia. Alabama Gulf Coast Potpourri, and she came across the Boyington story. But she's a little bit of a procrastinator, so she sat on it 20 years. And then she came back and asked me to co-author with her, but she decided she just couldn't do it. She had too much going on. But then I was already into it, so I continued it. Anyway, she was sitting there with me writing this foreword, trying to plan just what to say. And all of a sudden I heard a tap, like very soft, at the back door. The blinds were closed, so I couldn't see out. I went to the door, nobody was there. I went outside and looked up and down the street, no car, nobody. I went to the front door, nobody was there. She heard it too, though, it wasn't just me. We never have figured out what that was, but it was spooky because it was loud enough to hear, but not obtrusive. So it's just mystical how the story came about. And people, as I said, hear voices at the tree. And one other thing that happened that seemed impossible to say the least. Since Charles did have those 2 unqualified jurors, and all was based on circumstantial evidence plus 2 deathbed confessions, we got, as I started telling you a while ago, Victor Gaston, who was pro tem of the House of Representatives, involved. I did not even know him, but Shannon did, and we got John Tyson, the former DA, involved, and some of these things that you thought can't be done got done. So all we're waiting on now for that posthumous pardon is something I didn't even know existed until we sent the Board of Pardons and Paroles everything, and wrote to the governor and all of that. And that's a petition that has to be signed, not just by any attorney, but by an active attorney or an active circuit court judge. So Keith Blackwood is currently working on this, and he's running for, he's ADA, but he's running for the position, and he's pretty much said he will do it, because in the back of the book, John Tyson said that at the very least this should be a mistrial. And it's more in the back of the book, but you have to get the book to understand it. Now we're adding a new event. We had the event every year first we had the 2 days before shutdown of COVID, we had the play produced called The Truth is in the Tree, and it was produced at Gulf Quest Museum. Then the next time it was produced at Oakleigh as just a one-time play. And then we decided, since Mobile has nothing like To Kill a Mockingbird now, we decided to make it an annual event with the help of many, many people. And we're having it at Oakleigh, and Taylor's been very helpful about that. And we've had it 2 years, and next year will be the 3rd year. We have it, the mock trial is going to be an added event, and it's, let me get my pen. It's at the jail, as I said, and it will precede this because it'll be next weekend, the 4th, the 5th rather, and 6th. And we've got some high school students that are very good acting the parts in this. And then later in May, this was the month of the trial, November. In May, we have the annual Boyington Oak Festival. And this one includes a trolley ride, a copy of the book, a tour of Oakleigh, and the play. And it went over big. We've got one tour guide that brought people from Foley last year, because we go different places, you know, presenting. And then we want some more tour buses if we can get them. Of course, the tour buses could be from Mobile. It could be a church group that could bring 20 people. So it's, if you get a chance to go to any of these things, I have the flyers out there, and I have the book out there. And Paula and I are speaking at the DAR this Sunday on Mississippi Mojo and Murder Series. So that's about all I have to say, but I just think that maybe you would find it interesting if you're from Mobile. Even if you're not, you might want to learn the history.
Thank you, Ms. Mary. All right, next we have Ms. Taylor Volz, and she is the director of the Historic Mobile Preservation Society, as well as the Historic Oakleigh Home.
Yes. So I just wanted to say, if you guys were interested in the stuff that Tom was talking about as far as Victorian mourning practices and things like that, we do every October, we do some special events at Oakleigh called Mourning at Oakleigh, where we actually decorate the house and dress in the appropriate outfits and talk about Victorian mourning customs. So we've already done those events for this year, but we will be doing it again next October. So if that's something you guys are interested in, keep an eye out for it, because it's really cool. We bring in the coffin and do all the stuff at the house, which is really exciting. So I just wanted to touch on that. I am the director of the Oakleigh House and the Historic Mobile Preservation Society, so I'm going to kind of go through some stuff that has happened at the house. None of it's happened to me, but we'll get to that as we go. So, has anybody been to Oakleigh before? Okay, pretty good now. Okay, good. Has anybody experienced anything unusual at Oakleigh before? Okay, well, a lot of people have and a lot of people haven't, so it's kind of a mixed bag. But, you know, there's a lot of things that people, when they think of Oakleigh, they think of a lot of different things. They think of the long history of the home. It was constructed in 1833. They think of one or more of the 5 different families that owned and lived in the house. They think of the various major moments in history that it's been witness to, such as urban slavery, the origins of Mardi Gras and the Civil War, both World Wars, and many, many more. Others think of the large collection of antiques on the display that we have in the museum. Oakleigh's collection belongs to the parent organization, the Historic Mobile Preservation Society. And the collection includes an extensive portrait collection, one-of-a-kind china, and many more pieces ranging all the way back from the 1750s through the early 20th century when the house became a museum. A lot of people also think of the house in terms of its beauty, both in the home itself and the property. It's one of the finest and most famous examples of Greek Revival style architecture in Mobile. And we're also well known for the many mature live oak trees that grace the property, most of which are 200 years or older, making them older than the house itself, which is pretty exciting. But tonight, we're not here to specifically talk about the usual Oakleigh topics. We are here to talk about ghosts in the house. The majority of the haunting stories at Oakleigh are attributed to members of the Irwin family, 3 generations of which lived in Oakleigh between 1850 and 1911. So before the Civil War, all the way up through almost World War I. We had 5 family members of the Irwins who passed away at Oakleigh. So we had Corinne, Alfred, Margaret, Mary Anna, and T.K. Irwin, all passed in the home. And some hauntings are attributed to them, but quite a few are attributed to Daisy Irwin Clisby, who actually did not pass away at Oakleigh. But we'll see her name come up in some of the stories that come through. Before I get to those, let me first start by saying, this is what I tell everybody, I am about as psychic as a brick wall. So I don't get vibes, I don't get feelings. I've never had any experiences that I could not explain in some sort of rational way. Despite being obsessed with horror movies and stories, it's just never been in my wheelhouse. So everything that I'm going to tell you tonight will be stories of other people's experiences that they've had at Oakleigh. Some have been recorded in books, and the house has actually hosted multiple ghost hunting organizations, some of which have been successful capturing things and some of which have not. So the first section I'd like to read for you is instances that were recorded in a book called Mobile Ghosts, Alabama's Haunted Port City by a local author named Elizabeth Parker. And we do carry both of her books in the bookshop. This particular book was written about 2000, so it's a couple decades past by now, so some of these stories are a little bit older. But one of the ones that is often repeated is the story of a little boy on a tour who refused to go into the second parlor. If you've ever been in Oakleigh, we have a front parlor and then a rear parlor. So he was afraid to go into that second room. He politely but insistently asked to be guided into another space. Once he met up with the rest of the tour in the library, he said something along the lines of, "She likes this room." She is most often thought to be Daisy Irwin Clisby, who I mentioned earlier. In 1980, a newspaper photographer took a picture in the first parlor of 2 people sitting in the window. The photo actually was part of an article outlining Oakleigh's yearly candlelight Christmas that we do every Christmas. Unseen at the time, the photographer framed the shot, but quite clear when the photo was printed, is the figure of a woman who seems to float outside the window between the two people seated inside. Staffers at Oakleigh were fascinated, and a little digging around produced a picture of Miss Daisy Irwin Clisby, looking very much like the ghostly figure. Since then, the swishing skirts and gentler hauntings have been attributed to Miss Daisy, but according to the little boy, the energy in that second parlor was much less friendly, much colder and heavier. Other guests and docents have reported hearing people talking in rooms that are empty, doorbells ringing with no visitors, seeing shadows with no bodies to accompany them, and witnessing a chandelier shake for no reason. Now, our chandeliers are attached to the ceiling with a metal pipe that's about this fat. So those are not going to move just from people walking through the room. So it had to have been something that was physically making the chandelier move. And one docent, upon opening the house in the morning, found that all the furniture in the second parlor had been rearranged overnight. So some of the chairs that were facing outward in front of the fireplace had been turned to face in towards the fireplace, and the table had been moved so as like two people were sitting there enjoying the fireplace overnight, which is a little creepy if you think about it. So the next story I'm going to read for you is our former museum manager. Her name was Mary Newman. You may have met her. She was around for a long time. This is something that she wrote up in 2019 about her experiences at Oakleigh. And so this is from her point of view as I'm reading it. So it says, I'd like to start my story admitting that before I started working at Oakleigh, I did not actually believe in ghosts. I was 100% against the concept as a whole, but I definitely did not believe there were pieces left behind when someone died that could be visible, tangible, and interactive. And she says, working at Oakleigh has definitely changed that outlook. I've been hearing stories about Oakleigh being haunted since my first day as a volunteer, but I didn't believe any of it until about 6 months after I started spending time there. At that time, I was still an intern rather than a museum staff member, and I was working on my internship project. That day, the museum was closed and she was in the archives building, which is right next door. She needed to get some paperwork from inside the museum, so she got a key from the director and walked over there. And it was her first time going into the museum by herself. She says, on my way, I saw a young woman standing at the window to the original entrance hall. She was watching me walk towards the house, and she clearly remembers thinking I did not recognize her, but I assumed she was a volunteer or a staff member that I had not met yet, which would make sense, being as a new employee. She was wearing rather a poofy skirt to her dress and at least went down past what she could see in the window. Some of the guides at this time were dressing in costume, but not usually while the house was closed, so it was a little unusual. It says, when I went inside, I realized that the house was not only locked, but fully armed. The alarm system was on, so there was no possible way anyone could have been in the house without several members of the MPD being called in for setting the alarm off. It says, I tried to explain away what I saw that day. There wasn't any logical excuse at the time. There were even less as I saw her again later. They became even more flimsy after talking to the neighbors. I realized that she is visible at night quite frequently, and she apparently is the most friendly of our ghosts. Since that day, I've had many more experiences in my time working that I cannot explain. I've not only seen the woman in the window many more times, I've heard voices and music coming from nowhere. I've seen a broken music box play a song different than what's in it. I've seen playing cards move, doors swing open, and electrical issues with no clear cause that fix themselves, and the shadow of a man with no body in it. She told me that story. She was at the house one evening and she was downstairs and she looked up and there was a full-formed man's shadow at the top of the staircase. Which I'm sure was extremely frightening. So my thought is perhaps Mary was seeing the woman in the window as the very same spirit that was captured in that photograph taken in 1980. Or the same one all of those friendly hauntings are attributed to. It's a little bit of a mystery. You know exactly which woman all of these people are seeing. Are they seeing Miss Daisy, who didn't actually die in the house? Or maybe they're seeing her mother, Mary Anna, who I'll talk about in the next story. And then you guys can kind of decide which ghost you think it might be. So the next story was written by Stephanie Richardson, who was our former employee. She worked there from 2001 until August of 2002. So she says, throughout my time at Oakleigh, I had many strange experiences, although most of these were dismissed as just being a part of working in a historic building. Floors would creak, lights would flicker, and there would be the occasional cold draft while I was taking visitors on a tour, but nothing that ever made me feel suspicious that something otherworldly was taking place. However, I also experienced some things that were too unusual to excuse. For example, one day I was working alone at my desk downstairs when I heard a loud stomping upstairs. It sounded as though a man in boots was walking around, which was impossible since the doors were locked, and I didn't see anyone come in the building. When I went upstairs to investigate, the sound stopped. Shortly after I got back to work, I heard the sound again. There was no logical explanation for the sound, and there was no construction going on in the area, and the porch was empty. Another experience occurred when I was giving a tour. I had shown the group an image of Mary Ketchum Irwin, who is Daisy's mother, and remarked that I loved her poses in her photographs. We had developed a great rapport throughout the tour, so I went on to joke that I could get tips from Mary on how to pose for a picture, to which a visitor remarked that she isn't there, of course, for me to ask. I joked that perhaps I could perform a seance, which was popular, of course, during the Victorian era, and at that exact moment, one of the lamps in the room went out. So we all took that as a sign that Mary was not happy with the idea of a seance happening in her home. The most exciting experience occurred when we had some paranormal investigators visit at Oakleigh. In full disclosure, I was skeptical at best, but tried to keep an open mind. It was my job to stay upstairs and supervise the investigators in order to preserve the items in our exhibit. And one of the male investigators went into the Irwin bedroom alone. I could hear him asking questions, but couldn't hear any response. He excitedly came out of the room and asked if I wanted to hear something, to which I replied, absolutely I do. He asked, who do these wedding stockings belong to which you could hear a faint female voice reply, me. He asked, can you tell me your name? And the voice replied, Mary Anna. The wedding stockings in question belonged to T.K. Irwin's wife, Mary Anna, who's the mother of Daisy. I tried to consider alternate possibilities of the origin of the voice, but I was standing right there, and I knew he was the only one alone in that room. So perhaps it is indeed Mary Anna Irwin who is haunting Oakleigh and not her daughter Daisy. But that is something, I guess, for you guys to kind of decide on your own which one it might be. There have also been a few other instances of things being recorded, including a voice being recorded asking for a priest to come to the home, and a voice being recorded saying to move the music box back to where it belongs. So originally, the music box that one of our, Mary Newman, and one of our employees had heard making that sound was in the Irwin bedroom, and it has now since been moved to the library. And apparently shortly after that, some ghost hunters got a recording asking to move the music box back to the Irwin bedroom where it had been for a number of decades before that. So maybe it is Mary Irwin that's haunting the house, and she likes it exactly how she likes it. I was there for the ghost hunters when they caught Mary on the audio talking about her stockings, but I didn't get to experience anything, so that's okay. But that's fine with me. I have to be there all day, every day. You know, the less stress I have when I'm there, the better. So that's all I've got for you guys tonight. I encourage you to come visit Oakleigh if you haven't had a chance. We have a great tour, and thanks for everybody to come out and listen to us tonight.
All right, thank y'all. And at this time, we'll open it up to y'all. And if y'all got questions for our experts, please please let them know. I'm going to come around with a microphone, so if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone.
I would like to know how Charles Boyington had a descendant if he was only 19 years old and he was a single man.
Okay, those are descendants from his brother, sister, and he had another brother too.
You might have that not on.
Collateral. Oh. That's a good question.
Session.
Yeah, so that was from his brothers and sisters, not direct descendants. He did not marry Rose, they were engaged, and that was it. But that's a very good question.
My question's for Taylor. I'm a new resident of Mobile as of March of this year, so I don't know a lot of these stories. So can you explain a little more about the circumstances of the two women's deaths so I can decide who I think it is?
Oh, sure. Mary Irwin, who was the mother of Daisy and the wife of TK, passed away at Oakleigh in 1906. And I honestly, off the top of my head, can't remember. I think it may have just been old age. I'm not really sure. Now, her daughter Daisy ended up moving away when she sold the family house in 1911, and she ended up moving to New York for a while, where her son was living, and then eventually died in his country home, which was not in New York. It was in Connecticut. Tom, do you remember? Yeah, she went up north and stayed up north. You know, maybe she just had a lot of really great, I mean, she basically did grow up at Oakleigh. Maybe she had a lot of really great memories there and came back to it. You know, I'm one of those that tends to believe if it's going to be a haunted ghost, it's somebody that died there or had, you know, something bad happen. But I guess everybody has different beliefs when it comes to that kind of stuff. So maybe she just had a nice experience and wanted to be back. But I guess if I had to lean into it, I would probably say that it would probably be Mary. But that's just my opinion. Thank you.
So for the picture of the two people sitting in the window, where would we find that picture, or do you have the original picture of it?
I don't. That is a really good question. Oh, it's in the archives. Okay, so what I will do is I'll pull it out of the archives and I will put it on the Oakleigh Facebook page. And then that way everybody can look at it, because I haven't seen it myself. So thank you. I will pull it out and put it up there for you guys to look at.
I have a question for you too.
Okay.
Do you guys have any idea who the shadow, the man shadow
Oh,
was?
the man shadow. Okay, so the theory behind the man is the owner, the first owner of Oakleigh, the man that built the house. His name was James Roper. And he unfortunately didn't get to live there very long because of some financial troubles. He and his second wife lived there for only a few years before the house was repossessed by the bank, because there was a recession and he lost a lot of his wealth. And so a lot of people think that the male ghost is Mr. Roper coming back to haunt the house because he's angry that he lost it after, you know, putting so much time and money and effort into building the construction of it. So that's the theory going around. It could easily have been one of the Irwin men that also died there, but most people think it's Mr. Roper.
Thank you.
I had a question for Ms. Taylor as well. So, this shadow person, or Mr. Roper, as you would call him, would he also be attributed to the story you told of the boy who would go into the second parlor room because allegedly there was some... Wait, never mind. You said that there was some sort of presence in it that he said that that was her room?
So, I'm not really sure what you would attribute the heavy darkness to in the second parlor. I think the little boy was happier when they got into the library space, which is the room that tends to be more attributed to the Irwin family. So I'm not really sure if the badness in the second parlor would be Mr. Roper or something else. I've never gotten any feelings in there. Mostly when I take people on tours or when we have the ghost hunters there, they are finding and feeling things in the rooms associated with the Irwin family.
I also had another question. So, are there any other haunted locations in Mobile that we didn't get to mention?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot. Just about everything. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have another speaker tonight, Matt Green, who was going to talk about the ghosts at the Battle House, but I think he got sick. So, but the book that we carry, the one that's called Mobile Ghosts, Alabama's Haunted Port City, there's a lot of stories in that one, but there are tons of other haunted Mobile books too. So, and I'm sure they have them at the haunted bookstore. Oh, they have a whole section? Oh, they have a whole section.
I also had a question for Ms. Taylor. I'm not sure if I missed it in the story or not, but did y'all move the music box back?
No, they did not move it back, no.
Is there a specific reason as to why?
That's a good question. I don't know why they didn't move it back. I certainly could, I guess. There's no reason for me to keep it in the library room. I could move it back into the bedroom, I guess. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
This is for, sorry, I'm not going no. So this is about like the not wanting to be buried alive. I've heard about like some people putting like bells on their graves, like not being buried underground, but like being buried in a mausoleum, and like putting bells on it. So if they were still alive, they could ring the bells.
Yes, but they had that. The real panic was being underground and having 5 feet of dirt above you, suffocated. So the bells were part of this flag system, and then an electric bell, or there were stories of having like a church bell almost that you could pull and ring.
Were there any like occurrences of people actually being buried alive and like with the flags?
Not here in Mobile that I know of.
Okay.
But definitely, apparently it happened elsewhere, because it certainly captured a lot of people's imagination during the 19th century. Started at Edgar Allan Poe.
Anybody else?
I have a question. I don't need a
Okay.
microphone. Where can I get a Chippendale coffin?
Check Antiques Roadshow.
All right, well, thank y'all so much for coming out tonight, and thank you to our panel. Y'all go see Mr. Tom out at Bellingrath Gardens, and certainly purchase Miss Palmer's book outside, and attend one of the festivals coming up. And then go see Miss Taylor. I know if you've still got questions for her, right, we're going to be hanging around. So we'll hang around for a little bit. But please do as well join us upstairs for the refreshments that we'll have. And if you're so inclined, come take a Beanville White's food tour. And we've got a Bites and Frights tour coming up Thursday night, 2 weeks from now, November 10th. And that'll be at 5:30. And I've got some cards and stuff I can hand out for that as well. But thank y'all so much for coming out. Thank you to Ms. Paula Webb as well. Works here at South Alabama. And y'all have a great night. Thank you.